Reading the words carved into the white marble of the Jefferson Memorial's northeast portico, a visitor learns a lesson about education itself. Establish the law for educating the common people. This is the business of the state to effect, said Thomas Jefferson. The father of the University of Virginia understood that a role of government was to empower its people to combat the tyranny of government. And as an educated man who kept detailed weather records for 50 years to document Virginia's climate, the third president of the United States would surely have strong opinions about our 45th. As Mr. Jefferson also wrote, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. Education and engagement is the antidote to disinformation. Reports suggest that state officials in Alabama, Louisiana, and Wisconsin have manipulated the scientific content of their state natural resources publications, editing articles on climate change or ceasing the publications altogether. Well-educated communities can take responsive action. David Suzuki is calling on reporters to write about climate every day, the same way that business news covers the stock market. But the blogging community seems right to wonder, why the hell did the New York Times just hire a climate denier named Bret Stephens? Meanwhile, 3/4 of the architectural community believe that their own profession is not doing enough to combat climate change, and they could heed the advice given by Yale professor Tony Lazarowitz in his interview with PRI. Ethical professionals who engage in public education, explaining the scientific realities, can inoculate people against the disinformation campaigns. Scientific professionals are even preparing a protest march on Washington. Understandably, parenting magazines debate when it's appropriate to trouble young minds with the sad truths of our changing planet, but complacency is unacceptable, and the New Scientist magazine warned that climate change deniers exploit disillusion brought on by often gloomy scientific findings, and that public fatigue is the friend of those who would thwart science. Make no mistake, the forces of climate denial are powerful. A Senate bill is circulating in Tallahassee that would transform Florida's state education system, allowing citizens, even those without children, to challenge materials being used in the classroom as being non-balanced or inflammatory. Battles over creationism and climate change are coming soon, warn concerned activists. That classroom assault is not just a Florida problem. One Colorado schoolgirl, serving as a voice for the voteless, invited her climate change-denying congressman to her classroom for a science lesson. There's nothing fake about the stunning changes in the Arctic shown in a new Time magazine photo series. Yet the National Science Teachers Association sent a letter to its members warning them about a different piece of propaganda being distributed by the well-funded Heartland Institute. The document is being sent by direct mail to science teachers rather than subjected to the scrutiny of a peer-reviewed journal, but the Union of Concerned Scientists looked it over and found that virtually every assertion is false, controversial, or at best unclear. If the Heartland Institute truly believes in its mission to discover, develop, and promote free market solutions to social and economic problems, then it should listen carefully to recent statements by James Hansen. The distinguished NASA scientist and expert in climate change has criticized former President Obama's Clean Power Plan and instead openly supports a fee and dividend program, a Republican-leaning market-based approach to climate change that involves a fee on fossil fuels that's paid back to the American people. Scientific American even quoted Mr. Hansen as saying, "I'm optimistic we could get on a path that would then influence the world." For now, fishermen and farmers are on the front lines of climate change. While there's always room for hope, conditions on the Great Barrier Reef have gotten worse. One expert at the Australia Research Council, seeing the coral bleaching, told the press last year was bad enough. This is a disaster. Another professor said the widespread bleaching represented a complete change in the phenomenon that all of us study. In fact, Due to the reef's decline, Australia expects a $1 billion hit on its economy. Just as the reefs suffer, so will the fish. European scientists further warn that overfishing in the Mediterranean risks reaching a point of no return, and fishery managers are launching new sustainability efforts. Ocean acidification is affecting shellfish aquaculture in Maine, and rising seas are affecting coastal ecosystems. A Canadian university study suggests that farmers are unintentionally contributing to climate change too, because earlier thaws allow for exposed soils and nitrous oxide releases, much like disappearing permafrost is releasing methane into the atmosphere. Cover crops, however, if left in place for the winter, could solve the problem. Then again, as Bloomberg News noted, there was nothing normal about this winter and its tornadoes in Massachusetts. But farmers are feeling the effect of climate change. Potato crops are down in Japan due to typhoons and heavy rains, and some brands of potato chips have become valuable commodities. Vulnerable farmers in Egypt and India are changing their techniques to adapt to the changes in the hydrologic cycle and the saltwater intrusion effects of sea level rise. A new United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization report warns that the Near East and North Africa faces serious food insecurity, because if water resources are not managed more sustainably by improving water efficiency and productivity and shifting to less water-consuming crops, then climate change is expected to affect all 4 dimensions of food security: availability, access, stability, and utilization. A study in the journal PLOS ONE called for sympathy for the American farmer too. Agricultural businesses are impacted by climate change, not only by earlier spring, later winters, and altered rain and sunlight, but also by the number of working days available to crops. Farmers must carefully navigate the calendar, avoiding both killer frosts and excessive heat. Of course, not every farming issue is due to climate change. For example, some data suggests that Alabama's climate has cooled. But after interviewing farmers in Colorado, the Carolinas, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, the Huffington Post summed it up by declaring that climate change is ruining farmers' lives, but only a few will admit it. Research scientists seem to agree with that sentiment. Climate change seems likely to have extraordinary broad implications for agriculture and food systems, with potential effects upon crop yields, food webs, seeds, and don't forget the 6 foods: coffee, avocados, mangoes, maple syrup, fish and chips, and chocolate. Dietary changes could help, however, and the consumption of less red meat and more peas, beans, instead coupled with more fruits and vegetables, and whole grains instead of refined grains, could save money and mitigate climate change. But don't worry too much, suggested an Australian source, because the U.S. Department of Defense is well aware of the problem and treats food security as a global risk and requires planning akin to the threat of terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, or North Korea's nuclear capacity. Another disaster known as rising seas looms in South Florida, but the community, like much of the planet, is divided about the risks. Traveling to the county that is home to Mar-a-Lago, U.S. Senator Bill Nelson hosted a Commerce Committee meeting to discuss the devastating effects of sea level rise upon South Florida. As even the BBC has noted, Miami has more real estate at risk than anywhere else in the world, and joined the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact this week to coordinate mitigation and adaptation efforts with other cities and counties. Realtors in the Magic City are already worrying about raising buildings due to rising seas. West Palm Beach engineers, meanwhile, are trying to do magic with their flood control systems, holding back the high tides and capturing some of the public sentiment. Artist Hannah Rothstein has gotten press this week for her interesting retake on the National Park Service's posters, including one with dying mangroves in an Everglades wilderness shaped by rising seas. Adding future financial insult to the existing flooding injuries, Florida's coastal communities are especially dependent upon property tax revenues from the high-priced coastal communities that are going underwater. Leaders in the Florida Bar tax law section are exploring the issues and thinking about constitutional law implications in a state that prohibits an income tax. But across the nation, politicians seem increasingly out of touch with voters. New poll data shows growing concern about climate change in both U.S. political parties. The Denver Post notes that climate scientists in Colorado are performing basic research on essential survival subjects such as worsening wildfires and uncertain water supplies. The Daily Comment in Louisiana reports on low country residents retreating from the ocean and being relocated from their homes. News estimates say that rising seas could be catastrophic in the California Bay Delta, says the San Francisco Chronicle. Climate change has become a factor in the special election for the congressional seat in Atlanta. Congress might be forced to rethink President Trump's proposed harsh budget cuts to the Environmental Protection Agency, which even Senator Lisa Murkowski, a Republican from Alaska, chairwoman of the Interior and Environment Subcommittee of the Senate Appropriations Committee, called just the first step in a long process. Perhaps the federal fund that Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat from Rhode Island, proposed for protecting coastal infrastructure from sea level rise might even find bipartisan support. But the Washington Examiner openly wonders whether there's a rational middle ground on the climate change debate. Still, much of the English-speaking world seems to be experiencing a perplexing duality. As a result of Brexit, leaders of the United Kingdom are quietly joining the Trump administration and backing away from climate commitments, while environmental groups are threatening suits based upon the government's apparent violation of Britain's Climate Change Act. A controversial Irish businessman declared that climate change is complete and utter rubbish, while calling for investment in nuclear power. The Philippines closed the Climate Change Academy that was educating local governments about resilience, and some scientists in Quebec have had difficulty encouraging local communities to plan for climate disasters. And down under, an Australian science professor emeritus warns that the government's energy policy and lack of political will risks a catastrophic collapse of life, while local writers warn that a warmer ocean intensifies the cyclones that affect Australians. Rising seas are expected to be painful in Dunedin, New Zealand, too. Climate isolationism is impossible, and the absence of American leadership leaves a void to be filled. As the entire planet struggles with the realities of climate change, the G7 blames an easy target, the United States. NOAA still lacks an administrator. In fact, Politico reports that hundreds of senior official jobs remain vacant, and one of them, the next head of the Council on Environmental Quality, might be Kathleen Hartnett-White, who says carbon emissions are harmless and should not be regulated. While Michael Bloomberg's new book, Climate of Hope, looks to business and local governments for leadership, the New Republic argues that these institutions cannot solve the global problems without the feds. California is trying, reports the Los Angeles Times, but struggles to gain support even from like-minded neighbors like Oregon. And California legislators are doubting themselves, unsure about whether or not to renew the state's cap-and-trade program. The rest of the globe is trying too. Aware of the need for American participation and financial support, diplomats from China, as well as Brazil, India, and South America, are pressuring the United States not to withdraw from the Paris agreements. But the State Department already rewrote its climate change webpage, and EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt is openly calling for a Paris exit. China has much to lose, as the New York Times explained in an article about how rising waters threaten China's rising cities. The country is already relocating people from disaster zones. Scientific American even called President Xi the world's future energy leader, and for him, climate leadership is a chance to restore China's greatness. But some Canadians don't trust the Chinese. Other voices warn about the dark legacy of China's drive for global resources and China's growing accumulation of soft power through economic engagement. Despite his affinity for Paris, Thomas Jefferson, like President Trump, had isolationist leanings, and he cautioned against global alliances. However, Mr. Jefferson also recognized that in international affairs, the United States must stay informed. On Europe, he insisted we should keep an eye on them, that we should know them, and he also knew that reason must overcome the errors of opinion. As he said in a letter to Virginia lawyer and historian Samuel Kershival, time and advancing science will ripen us all in its course and reconcile all to wholesome and necessary changes. Time and science are teaching humanity about climate change.